Good afternoon, everyone. Really glad to be back with you. And I'm actually very excited today to be speaking to Brian Berletic, who previously was someone that I followed religiously on global affairs, Tony Cartolucci. And Brian is one of those rare journalists and analysts that has absolutely unwavering integrity and honesty, and I'm really, really proud to have him on the podcast today. Welcome, Brian. Can you just give the audience a little bit of information about your background and where they can find your work?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. And I really appreciate that. And also, I had been following your work for quite some time. Also, throughout the conflict in Syria, there were very, very few people who were getting it right consistently throughout the conflict, and you were one of them. And so I actually relied a lot on your information as well. So my background is I started out as a U.S. Marine at a very young age. I joined when I was 17, and then almost immediately once I got in, I was quite brainwashed. I'll admit. I was very patriotic, and I thought that I was signing up to defend my country, but very, very quickly you realize that that's not the case. And you have a choice to make whether you're going to keep lying to yourself because of how invested you are in the path that you're on, and also because of the consequences of leaving that path. There are a lot of consequences. So the things that I saw, and I was never in combat. I was in when 9/11 happened. I was in right as they were getting ready to invade Iraq in 2003. I got out at that point. I was never going to go to combat. I wasn't infantry or anything. I fixed sophisticated weapon systems. That was my job. And so it was no worry about that. It was just, in principle, I did not agree. I could see what was going on, and as a matter of fact, a lot of people around me could see what was going on. But again, they did not want to face the consequences of getting out and restarting their life. But I ended up doing that, and then since then I've been doing a lot of research, and then I decided to start writing, and that was just out of frustration, looking at what's going on, and then looking at how the Western media was presenting it to the public. The deliberate lies, it's so frustrating. And I didn't want to, so that's why I picked a pen name, because I didn't want to be known. I didn't want to be on camera or even doing audio. A lot of people at that time were asking me to come on to shows. I said no. For the longest time, I wrote under the pen name Tony Cartolucci. There was a couple of other pen names I wrote under, also Joseph Thomas, Gunnar Olson, a couple, because I was a very prolific writer, and people could not, just put my articles on their site every day. So they would switch up the names so it looked like other people.
That's interesting. I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah, and I was happy to keep it that way too. I wanted to stay anonymous, but I had people constantly trying to dox me. I've got a large crowd of expats here in Thailand who absolutely hate me, and they have been because they couldn't figure out who I was. They made up a story about who I was, and they got it completely wrong. They couldn't be more off course with their claims. So then I eventually had to come out because the U.S. Embassy was making statements about my work, an English language blog in Thailand. Well, who could that be? I'm the only one doing writing about U.S. interference in Thailand in English. And Facebook and Twitter deleted my accounts on the same day, not just my political accounts, but my personal accounts in my real name. So that means they knew who I was. And so being anonymous was no longer protecting me. It was kind of becoming a liability. So I decided to come out. And even now I do videos mostly on YouTube under the new Atlas. And then in the video description under each video, there are other places you can find my work on: Telegram, Odyssey, Rumble. And that's just in case they delete me off of YouTube. Also, I had a website. It'll be back up eventually. But for now, I'm still using my old blog, landdestroyer.blogspot.com. I still update that regularly.
Oh,
So
okay.
I guess, yeah, that's the rundown of
Mm.
my background.
Yeah, fascinating. I love this kind of. I think all of us, to some extent, were pushed into doing what we do by the sheer frustration at the lies and the misleading narratives and the paving the way to war that was being done by Western media was just so horrific that I think anyone with a conscience feels that they have to start to fight back somehow. But yeah, I understand that being bent out of shape to do this.
Yes, yes.
But
And the thing is, oh, well, the thing is, I mean, people are hesitant to do it. A lot of people say, "Oh, you're just doing this for money and to be famous." And I mean, you're constantly waging a battle uphill. You
yeah,
constantly have people attacking you, trying to
yeah,
destroy you. You have, companies, corporations deliberately targeting you and removing you off of
yeah,
their platform. I mean, that is not what kind of way of life is that to choose?
exactly.
You're yes, just as you said, forced into it. There's no choice.
Uh, yeah. Well, there's no choice because you. I think it was Dag Hammarskjöld that famously said in his book Markings, "You don't choose the way chooses you," and basically that has always resonated with me. It's not that you are necessarily comfortable on the way that you have chosen, but you know in your conscience that there's no other thing that you can do at this stage because particularly now, we are really uh, at such a transformational time in world history, looking at it positively, but it's also a very dangerous time in world history. And providing alternative information and alternative views. People don't have to accept our views as gospel, and I certainly don't expect them to. But what I hope to try and do, I guess, is to persuade people that they can also find the answers and they can also go looking for the truth. It's not actually that difficult to find. I know they're trying to make it harder. But I think all of us have this, and it's certainly not driven by money. If it was driven by money, I'd have given up long ago.
Yes,
But this desire to sort of figure out what is going on and how best to combat it and how best to help people generally understand what's going on. And I think now there is a greater wellspring of good independent media, and even if it's not perfect, it is at least offering some fight against this whole machine, this whole media consortium that is fighting against all the non-aligned bloc of countries. Brian, what I wanted to try and do today with you, amongst a couple of other things, is to try and explain or to demonstrate to people how the media compartmentalizes narratives. For example, we've gone from Syria to COVID to Ukraine to now China starting to infringe on the Ukraine narrative. And each time we're kind of parceled off to the next narrative, the previous one is kind of forgotten. And in that process, we forget that all these projects, all these globalist projects, are linked both by those who are behind them, the organizations that are funded by the intelligence agencies to promote and sustain these projects. Can you just talk a bit about that? Because I know a lot of your work focuses on that.
yes. So it's true. They pass us from one cause or distraction to the other. But if you're really paying attention, you'll notice that all of these things are constantly ongoing, whether they're putting attention on it or not. So people that really dig into the crisis in Syria, the war in Syria, really, I mean, that has been in the works for decades,
Mm.
in one way or another. The same goes for US policy towards peer and near peer competitors. So that means the Russian Federation and China, both of these countries. The US has spent decades trying to encircle and contain, undermine, and break up. and before the Russian Federation, the Soviet Union, and talking about health matters, a big pharma, giant pharmaceutical corporations, that has been a huge block in, maybe you could call it an oligarchy, the entrenched monopolies of Western power. They have been around for decades, highly abusive, and they've worked their way into the media, into legislation, and into policy everywhere. And they're everywhere. And so they have all together, they've been working on their own little projects this whole time, and they're all connected. People just need to follow the money. It's not some deep, dark conspiracy. There's these think tanks where you just go to their they have a website, and you click on donors or sponsors, and all of these corporations are all listed there. And what they do is they pay these groups of so-called experts to devise policy papers. They create these policy papers. They get a team of lawyers to turn them into a bill, and then they send them with a team of lobbyists to Washington to get them rubber stamped. And at the same time, they work with the corporate media. Many times the corporate media is actually a part of these think tanks. But if not, they have a close cooperation. They will convince the public that this is in their best interests, that this is the thing they need to know about, need to be concerned about. And this is what they do from one thing to the next, whether it's Syria, Libya, Iraq, now Ukraine, or if it's about turning a country like China into an enemy, or if it's about giving pharmaceutical giants more control over everything and actually undermining human health care in the process. That's what they'll do. And I mean, if you look at some of these media companies, look at their board of directors, you will see people from, say, Pfizer on their board of directors. It's very transparent, and none of this is hidden. I would say it's buried, but it's not hidden. It's all publicly available information, and you just need to look at it and see it for yourself. The Western media will never do this. We have to do it on our own. It takes a little practice, but once you start doing it, you'll see that it's actually a very easy process, and it's a process you can repeat over and over again. Just follow the money. That is first and foremost. That's what people need to do. It's a cliche, but I think it's a cliche for a reason. It's a very valuable way to analyze matters.
And I think also now it's becoming even more transparent. I mean, previously people kind of poo-pooed the Bilderbergers as conspiracy, but now, I mean, you have you have Davos, you have the WEF, and basically you've only got to look at the attendees list in the media consortium that is invited to fully understand who is controlling narratives and who's controlling the direction of the globalist projects, right? I mean, so it's, excuse me, since COVID, it's become actually so blatant and so transparent that when people kind of turn around and say, yeah, it's just a conspiracy theory, I'm like, well, no, it's not. It's in, it's sort of clear and present now. It's right there in front of you. It's not like we're not having to do anything other than to read what's being put in front of us and interpret it, right?
It is becoming increasingly transparent, but I think that's because it's becoming increasingly desperate on their part. I just think back 10 or 20 years, what the alternative media looked like, and look at it now, and look at Russia and China and other countries are starting to follow their example, asserting themselves, communicating their message to international audiences, and contesting this narrative that the West has held a monopoly over for I would say generations. I mean, imperialism, and it had gone from British imperialism, and it shifted to this Anglo-American, and now Anglo-American and European imperialism, where they're all kind of cooperating. It's like a bunch of companies merging because they're in the process of going out of business, and they're trying to merge to salvage everything. This is what these empires have done. And it's multipolarism emerging. So this idea of unipolarism and the interests behind it, they're desperate, and that's why they're coming out. They're being less careful about how they put their message out there. They're more direct. They're more combative, openly, overtly, instead of being kind of sneaky and keeping that facade of civility. That's
Yeah.
all gone. It's all totally gone. And they're just basically saying, we have to stop China. We have to get Putin out of power. Like they're not
Yeah.
even talking about democracy or I have people who don't follow politics sending me messages. They're like sending me articles, and I just think it's strange because they never were into politics, and they send something about this crisis in Ukraine, and they're talking about Europe arguing, and they'll tell me, do you notice in this article that they're not even talking about saving lives or pretending it's about democracy? They're just all worried about how their economies are falling apart and their
Yeah.
ability to make money is being
Yeah.
impeded. It's falling apart. It's getting,
Yeah. And not to
it's
mention all the years that they have decimated countries in the Middle East and Latin America and Central African Republic
yes.
through their interventionist programs and their globalist projects. I mean, yeah, it is quite extraordinary the flip around on crying victim now that they've come up against enemies, I guess, in Russia and China. And as you have said, particularly with Russia, I mean, the war against Syria has been ongoing since its independence from French mandate in 46, with CIA and MI6 projects, all, of course, anti-communist in speech marks, right? And we talked
Yes.
about this the other day, how many of these organizations that are now sort of rowing up to attack China in the information war come at it under the banner of anti-communism. So like the victims of communism, which is probably one of the biggest. But the anti-communism, the kind of McCarthyism that has driven much of these projects was there a long time ago, right?
It was, it was a way of simplifying it and packaging it in a way that looked like some sort of moral imperative. And they're still trying to do
Yeah.
that. They can't say, well, we need to stop China because they're not white. They can't say that. So they have to try to find some other
Yeah.
distinguishing, even if they have to kind of make it up. And they do the same thing to Russia also. I mean, there's a lot of people who are still equating it with the Soviet Union, which makes no sense at all. But that's what they think will work with the population. A lot of the things that they say, a lot of these phrases and labels that they come up with, this is to manipulate public opinion, manage it, build consensus. If they can whip up people to be, they know there's a lot of people say in the United States, we're just plain racist and don't like China because they're Chinese. They already know they've got their vote. And then they're going to do the anti-communist routine to get those people on board, and then they'll work on the human rights angle. And they've got all of these angles that they're working on to try to recruit people from different segments of society. And it's really interesting if you look at American society and you see how these people are diametrically opposed on so many different issues, but because of the way they tweak the message for each group, they're all on board with confronting China. It's very interesting when you see them doing that.
But it's kind of the thing is, it is the same playbook, isn't it? It's the same playbook used against Iraq, against Libya, against Syria, against Russia, and now against China, particularly. And I know you've done a huge amount of work exposing the Uyghur propaganda in China. And can you just talk a bit about that and talk about the NGO complex that is behind that and how disconnected it is from reality on the ground in Xinjiang province, which is of course where the Uyghurs live, and even in mainland China, and even further afield in Thailand, in Taiwan, etc.
Yes, because it's the same organizations. It's the same organizations. They have one way that they approach this, and all they do is change the names of the groups. And I mean, some of the accusations are identical that they'll come up with. If you look at Xinjiang, this is the US and its allies claiming that China's carrying out some sort of systematic genocide. after they themselves stirred up separatism, violent terrorism in Xinjiang. They were trying to carve the region off of China, and China was reacting using anti-terror measures. And the way they did it was, the way the US did this was pretend that the terrorism never happened, even though their own media reported on it in the past, and only show people the anti-terror measures. And when people see that, because they're not going to look into it themselves, they're asking themselves, well, why are they doing this? Because they didn't see the footage of people driving vehicles into markets and running people over and killing people, hundreds of people at a time. If that was happening in the US, they would fully understand why there needed to be anti-terror measures put into place. But they don't understand the full story there. They did the exact same thing in Baluchistan in southwest Pakistan. Baluch separatists, they're stirring them up. They're trying to carve southwest Baluchistan, Pakistan off of the country. And then as Pakistan responds, they say, look what Pakistan's doing to these poor people. And they'll only tell you half of the story. And they just repeat that. Every single country, they repeat that. In Syria in 2011, they trained these agitators ahead of time. They got the militants ready ahead of time. They stirred up trouble. And then they had the armed militants out on the streets killing people on both sides. And when Syrian security services started reacting to that, to preserve peace and stability, they said, look at what they're doing to these peaceful protesters, because they had the ability at the time to only show one side of the story, and the specific part that would incriminate Syria, and leave out all of the parts, all of the context that would explain why Syria was doing that. And Libya, same exact story. And by the way, I mean, people, they see my analysis on, say, Syria or Libya, and they say, I agree with you 100%, but I completely disagree with you about Thailand. Thailand is a monarchy that's evil, has a military government, and the people are freedom fighters fighting against it. I understood what was going on in Libya and Syria in 2011 because I witnessed it myself with my own eyes here in Thailand in 2010, the year before the Arab Spring. The US had a color revolution going on here. They were red shirts. And even though that they're using, socialist or communist slogans and symbols, their leader is a billionaire, Thaksin Shinawatra. He's hiding overseas with the help of the US and the British. And all of the organizations, the key organizations promoting, supporting, sometimes leading these protests that are still ongoing even to today, they're all funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. I understood what was going on in Libya and Syria so clearly because I watched them do it here. And it really is just one playbook and one set of tools that they use. And they just do it over and over and over again. Ukraine 2014, Belarus, right before this conflict started in Ukraine, they were doing the same thing. They got caught on camera admitting what they were doing in Belarus. How deeply involved they were in the country's internal political affairs, and the fact that they were pursuing regime change through these staged protests. So it really is. It's the same thing over and over again. And if people, again, if you just followed the money, if you see a protest break out somewhere, don't look at the ideological cues that are being given. Find a name of a leader or an organization and find out who funds them. Find out who they're affiliated with. And then the truth will reveal itself very quickly to you. So it'd be a very easy process.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I think in one of your most recent videos at the New Atlas, the fact that Thailand now is finally taking steps to bring the law to bear against foreign NGOs that are doing nothing to benefit Thailand, and of course are being used as a kind of Trojan horse to infiltrate society, to determine possible opposition members to be exploited, etc., etc. And of course, they're being demonized for it by the very NGOs that for decades have been used as a weapon of destabilization by the CIA and by the US State Department, by the British, etc. Right? Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that I find that extraordinary, the reaction.
Yes. So I mean, the process here is just think about it this way. The U.S. is at war with everyone. It wants global hegemony, and it is in conflict with every nation on earth in one way or another. It does not have to manifest itself as an actual superficial war with soldiers. There are other ways that they can uh, target your infrastructure or ruin your economy. They don't necessarily need to use military means, but it is war by other means anyway. And the National Endowment for Democracy is one of these things that get into a country, and US aid is like is a very similar component. So the
Mm.
NED subverts a nation politically. The US aid goes into remote areas and tries to uh, cut off their dependence on the central government to encourage separatism. And the
Mm.
NED is doing that politically, putting these ideas into people's heads, building up cadres in the media, infiltrating education, and basically just creating cadres of pro-American political circles. That's what they're doing. And yes, that's what they're doing here in Thailand. And Thailand is passing an NGO law. And if you read the NGO law, what they're proposing is, hey, if you need to tell people where you're getting your money from and what you're doing with it. You claim that you're serving the public, demonstrate some transparency. And these so-called NGOs are always demanding transparency of everyone else, and yet they demonstrate none on their own. So that's what the law is doing. And they're acting as if it's some sort of affront to freedom. You know, they said freedom of association because they're not allowed to secretly associate with foreign interests while claiming to be independent non-governmental organizations. So the media, the Western media, is going to attack the Thai government, pressure them to reverse this. The NGOs themselves, obviously, I mean, it's that this is their livelihood. They'll have
Mm.
to go get real jobs if this bill passes and they get shut down. And because people in Thailand do not support what they're doing, they're not interested. A lot of
Mm.
them aren't even aware of these organizations, and the ones who are, they are not going to contribute to it financially, so that they get all of their money from abroad.
Mm.
And you have to think the idea that the US is promoting democracy by funding these organizations is ridiculous. If you understand that democracy is a process of self-determination and everything these organizations are doing are determined in Washington, then it's clearly not self-determination. It's clearly foreign interference. And the US would not tolerate any of this,
Mm.
not for a moment. And yet they're doing this to nations all around the world, including Thailand, and they expect them to just take it. And the reason why Thailand has taken so long to address this and why they're still being so careful, a lot of people ask me, why don't they just round them all up and arrest them or throw them out of the country? It's not that easy. I mean,
No.
Thailand is not, I mean, even Russia and China, there's limits to their power. They're not all powerful. And a nation like Thailand, even less so, they have to
Mm.
be very careful because there's very real consequences for this. In 2015, between 2014 and 2015, there were these Uyghur terror suspects that were being brought through Southeast Asia, out of Xinjiang, through Southeast Asia, and then to Turkey, and then into Syria to fight alongside ISIS and Al Qaeda.
Mhm.
The Thai government arrested several of them, and were going to extradite them back to China upon Beijing's request. The United States demanded that Thailand allow them to travel to Turkey, and the Thai government said, no, we're sending them to China. And so in 2015, there was a huge bomb, killed 20, 25 people in downtown
Mm.
Bangkok, mostly Chinese tourists. It was a shrine right in downtown. I mean, I've walked past this shrine many, many times. And that's the price you pay for not being obedient to the United States. That is what they'll do to you. We've seen this all over the world. We've seen countries targeted,
Mm.
politically, economically, diplomatically, through means of terror and even just overt military aggression. That
Mm.
when the U.S. wants its way, there's many things they're willing to do to get it.
Mm. Um, just going back to, I mean, it's interesting talking about Thailand. In your opinion, if China is clearly now in the crosshairs of US and UK, and EU globalism. Will Thailand be caught up in that because of its perceived affiliation with China?
Well, it's interesting. I have lived in Asia pretty much my entire adult life. I've been in Thailand since 2004, and I have watched it transform because of China's rise, and it's in a very positive way. And I've watched the U.S. trying to derail this through their political meddling, the violence and the destruction versus the constructive trade and literal construction being done together with China, and not just in Thailand but also Laos to the northeast. I had traveled through Laos by bus. It took 3 days. Now they have a high-speed rail going through there. I mean, that's how China is transforming this region. And all of these countries are now targets because their number one trade partner, investor, infrastructure partner, even in terms of defense, is China. That is their number one partner. And the US knows this, and they're trying to turn these countries against China. They're trying to encircle, contain, isolate China. And the only way to do that is either coercing its neighbors to turn against it or overthrowing their governments and putting in a client regime that will just irrationally promote anti-Chinese policies and destroy their own economy in the process. Exactly like Ukraine from 2014 onward, how they destroyed their ties with Russia and now are literally destroying their country. That's what the U.S. wants to repeat here in Southeast Asia, and it's ongoing. The NED is involved in every one of these countries. In neighboring Myanmar, there's an armed conflict in Myanmar between U.S.-backed political forces and the central government and military. And I mean, that is very serious, and you don't hear much about it because it's devolved into this barbaric terrorism. And the Western media had been promoting these so-called freedom fighters in the media. You cannot even show a single day's worth of news from out of Myanmar without people seeing what's really going on now. And that is the fate that awaits every country in this region if they don't start protecting themselves against the various means and levers that the U.S. pulls to try to turn these countries or undermine these countries. And it's because of the rise of China.
I mean, we saw, well, really, if we look at it, that's what happened with Syria, because Iraq was targeted, Libya, effectively all of the friendly neighbors of Syria were, reduced to economic failed states and just devastated states, colonized states in the case of Iraq, and failed states on every level with Libya, of course. And then at the same time, in parallel mode, they've been working on Lebanon, and of course Lebanon now is really an economic disaster. It's in economic freefall. And there are still huge British intelligence operations ongoing there to, as you say, to further separatism, animosity against Hezbollah, etc. So I mean, this is a playbook, and I think very few people realize how intensely damaging it is to these countries. As you said, they don't care about the people of Ukraine. Ukraine is just it's a piece on the chessboard for them. The people of Ukraine are of absolutely no consequence to them, right? And so this whipping up of solidarity with Ukraine is entirely hypocritical, as it is and has been in Syria, in Libya, in Venezuela, etc., etc. And I think people, because what I find a little bit disheartening sometimes is people will say to me, just as they've said to you, well, I get your stand on Syria, I get your stand on Palestine, but come on, China. And it's it's just, but it's the same thing, right?
It is. It's exactly the same thing. I have noticed this. I've noticed people that get Ukraine perfectly right on every level, and yet they believe the Western narrative regarding China. And why? I can't say from person to person exactly why, but I think it ranges everywhere from just personal prejudice. They
Mm,
don't like Chinese people. They're
or they
different.
don't
They don't like
understand
them.
them, maybe because
Well,
you know,
exactly.
yeah.
They're not Western. They have their
Mm,
own way of doing things. Same everywhere in Asia. It's
mm,
very, very different than the West. Just because it's different doesn't mean that it's inferior or evil or some kind of threat. I guess it's human nature. When they see something they don't understand, they're afraid of it.
mm,
The Western media doesn't help, but I just wish people would just ask themselves, well, if everything that they said to me about Ukraine is a lie, and I quite clearly see that, why would you believe even a single story about, like, where are you getting your information about China? And some of them do get it from these I would call them fake alternative media, where it's just
mm.
corporate media uh, uh, retreating back to a position that looks like alternative media. I saw Glenn Beck do that. I've seen a lot of,
Yeah.
especially people on the right, they do that, and then they take this anti-China position while hitting other notes just right. And I think
Mm.
it is. It's to muddy the water and make sure that at least in one way you're carrying the agenda. You're helping carry the agenda, even
Yeah,
if not
absolutely.
on Russia, then at least on China. And if they've got you carrying at least part of it, well, then you're doing your part to carry the whole thing down
Mm.
down the
Yeah,
road into the
exactly.
future.
Yeah, it's
People,
yeah, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, people need to go to China and see for themselves
Yeah.
what it is like. Even me being in Asia, it had been a while before I finally got to China, and there were a lot of stories that I just, I didn't know if it was true or not. Maybe
Mm.
in the back of my mind, I thought maybe it was true, but I just didn't know. When you go to China, you'll see with your own eyes. It's a country just like everywhere else. The people are exactly like people everywhere else. They're nice, they're hardworking, they're friendly. They don't have some kind of design. They're not in and out the gulag. It's incredibly advanced.
Mm.
I went to China in, I think it was around 2006, 2007. This was before they even had the high speed trains, and even then it was already ahead of a lot of the infrastructure that I was used to dealing with in the United States. The train is on time, which I cannot say the same for Amtrak in the United
You
States.
certainly can't say the same in Europe.
Yes. So, I mean, it was amazing. It was amazing, and it changed my perspective on everything. And then I went from China through Laos to get back to Thailand. I did all of this over land and sea, and I saw with my own eyes these Chinese construction crews building these desperately needed highways through Laos to cut that 3-day trip through winding mountain roads into a day by road, and now with the high speed rail, hours, just mere hours. It's incredible. And that
Mm.
is what nations need to advance. That is what nations need to pull themselves out of poverty. They need infrastructure. They need the ability to reach other markets that are thriving so that they can give what they have to offer and get in return what people are willing to pay for it. That's what China is doing all
Mm.
over. They're not interested in political meddling. I have not seen anything even remotely similar to the National Endowment for Democracy from on
Yeah.
China's part. They don't think that way. They think of business as a mutually beneficial proposition, and business can be two things. It could be that, or it could be a one-way exploitative uh, manner, and that matter, and that's what the U.S. sees it as.
Mm-mm.
And that's how they saw business doing business. They're like, oh, the U.S. does business with China, yeah, but it's in this very one-way exploitative manner
Mm.
where they expect to just use China and keep China subordinated to them. Doesn't matter that they have 4 or 5 times the population, uh,
Exactly.
incredible infrastructure, an advanced society. They're not allowed to surpass the U.S. because I don't know, because I think it's because they just think, well, we're Americans and they're Chinese. It doesn't matter how many, we're still better than them.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think it's just this global primacy thing that the US now, refuses to let go of. I mean, it's you're right. I think we're seeing a huge level of desperation from the media, from the, I mean, there was something a couple of days ago about the countries that had pushed back against the WHO, World Health Organization, power grab, you know, and it's total violation of nation sovereignty. And the bloc of African countries that pushed back, more than 47 countries, Russia, China, India, South Africa, Malaysia, etc., you know. So I think what the war in Ukraine has done is drawn very clear lines for me. And that's why I think it's kind of important right now to show people, because a lot of people who were very good on COVID are now sort of criminalizing Russia and China from the perspective of them being in on this Western-centric globalist WEF Davos project, right? I have an issue with that, because I think they are not seeing the East and West divide culturally that you've just described actually perfectly. Right. And so they're wanting to find links between what Russia and China is doing and how that ties into this very Western-centric COVID project, linking into WEF, etc. But what somebody said to me fairly recently, and that makes a lot of sense. Look, technology is not going to stop advancing, but it's whether you use technology for good or for bad. That for me is the big difference. And I've never been to China. I've never been to Thailand. But from what you're saying, the improvements made through China in Thailand are very similar to what I'm hearing from inside Africa. It's very similar to what I'm experiencing here in Syria with the whole Belt and Road Initiative. You know, China has been a relatively quiet ally in Syria, except of course for the vetoes at the UN. But at the same time, there's this undercurrent of assistance, and of course they have to be careful because of the Caesar Act. They can't be seen to be too publicly helping Syria, because that'll be used as a stick to beat them with amongst all the others that are being used, right? But one thing that I wanted to ask, because this is something that comes up whenever I talk to anyone positively about China, is this whole concept of debt enslavement. So how people perceive this positive input from China, they see it as, well, yeah, but all that China's doing is pouring money in, and then that country is basically enslaved to China for the rest of its life.
Yeah, I mean, according to who? According to the same people that told us Ukraine, you know, there's no Nazis in Ukraine. There were WMDs in Iraq. Assad is gassing his own people. I mean, the exact same people talking about debt diplomacy or whatever, their debt trap diplomacy. They're the same people who have repeatedly lied to us. And it's very clear that it's the exact same people. And I just wonder how many times they have to make fools out of ordinary people before they'll get tired of it, get tired of being made fool. Like right now with this whole situation in Ukraine, being told for months that Ukraine was winning, and now the sudden change of tune, that didn't happen overnight. That was the way it was since the beginning of this in late February. They were lying. They're constantly lying, and they're also lying about China. Of course, when you're building a huge infrastructure project, there's going to be debt. It's manageable. It's something. It's called an investment. That's what an investment is. You know it's going to cost you, and then you have to pay it off over time. Is it worth it or not? Do nations need railways? Yes, absolutely. Do they need highways? Yes, absolutely. Who's going to build them if not China? The United States, the US, and Europe had decades of primacy over all of these regions of the planet. They could have been building all of this infrastructure. Instead, they did actual debt trap diplomacy, you know, with the World Bank and the IMF. And we saw that. We saw them lend all of this money and then take over their country. And they weren't building infrastructure with it. It was just a scam to get them in debt and then put them into receivership. And then, you know, where is where's the infrastructure? There is none. That's why China is coming in and building it now, because it doesn't exist. So it's them projecting. It's them projecting and preying on the ignorance of people and their prejudices, because some people may begin waking up to the fact that they're being lied to, but when it comes to something like China, that they already have their own prejudice against, they want to take information that reinforces that and, you know, assimilate it, and they don't care that it's the same people they know lied to them about other things. It's quite frustrating. It's actually, I think it's quite sad, but that's what we have to continue doing to try to wake people up. And you know, there's a lot of different approaches that people use, and there's people that get other things right, but they get that wrong. And instead of, you know, going to war with them, I mean, we have to start cooperating on the things that we agree on, trying to either look into the things we disagree on, or just leaving that alone for now and coming back to it later. This idea that everyone has to, I had in the comment sections all the time, people like, I can't believe you promoted that person. You know, it's like, you don't have to agree with someone on everything. I'm talking about a specific video that I agree with. I mean, people have to start being a little more sophisticated, because the people running things into the ground are very sophisticated. We need to be as sophisticated if we're going to overcome this.
Yeah, and I mean, I often get that as well. If I share, for example, a mainstream article, and I take out of that mainstream article what I find interesting, people will jump on it immediately. Why are you sharing this? Why are you sharing The Guardian? Or, you know, and I'm like, well, because if you don't, what was it, Sun Tzu probably said, you know, if you don't know your enemy, then how on earth can you fight this war? You know, you have to know what angle they're coming from, however lunatic that angle is. It's, you know, and it's probably it's probably going to become more and more lunatic as their backs are pressed against the wall, because now, you know, they've gone through the weak countries now, and you know, no disrespect to the countries that they have decimated, including Syria, where I live. But now they've kind of hit the brick wall of Russia and China, you know, and how I feel is that people need to put aside their cognitive dissonance, their doubts about the cultures of these countries, their gaslighting that, you know, these are authoritarian regimes, these are communist regimes, etc., etc. Everything that's been programmed into them for decades, right? And start understanding that how I put it very simply is, if Russia were to lose the war in Ukraine, our world is screwed. It's totally screwed. You know, what comes after? Actually, I can't concretely say what this world will be like. But for me, it has to be better from a perspective of someone living inside a country that has been economically, militarily gang raped by the West, in Syria, right? The people are 85% of the population now living in the Syrian government protected areas are below poverty lines that you can't even imagine in the West, right? So for me, when you look at it from an Eastern-centric point of view, this is the last battle, right?
It seems like that, yes, or very close to it, because they're still going to try to repeat the whole process over Taiwan.
Yeah.
Well, I want to get back to what you were saying about ideology. You know, I see ideology as a set of tools. People accuse me of being a fascist, a communist, a socialist, anarchist, and the thing is, I see ideologies as tools, a set of tools. When you see a problem, you find which tool works the best, solves the problem in the most efficient and humane way possible. And then if another tool calls for solving that other issue, then you use that one. I see China actually doing this quite a bit, where it's supposed to be a communist country, but they use all kinds of different tools that are associated with different ideologies, and it works. Just imagine you're trying to build a house and you try to do it with just a hammer. You're not gonna build a house. It's impossible. You need a whole set of tools with different capabilities to do. Like, I'm not talking like fascism, obviously. I'm not saying like sometimes fascism is okay, but I think you understand what I'm trying to
Yeah,
say about
totally.
free markets, socialism, communism, centralization, decentralization. It's not a one size fits all. You have to use a variety of approaches to solve different types of problems. And I think that's what a lot of people have a problem with. They're in these ideological straitjackets.
Yeah.
They're trying to build a house with just a hammer. And they're saying, I can't go along with China because it's communist. And they're not even looking into what that means and how it manifests itself inside China day to day for people. I mean, if you walk around in China, it looks like anywhere else in the world that you ever have gone.
Yeah.
I mean, they've got stores, people have property, people are driving their own cars. So like, how is that different? And just very, there's some key fundamental ways that their society is different, but day to day, they're living more or less the same as anyone else anywhere else. I mean, you do enough traveling, you start to realize that people live almost the same way everywhere you go. They're all basically like nice, hardworking people. The vast majority of people everywhere are, and you start to shed some of these ideologies that you've been clinging to or hiding behind, or I guess maybe constrained by, and you just keep an open mind and look at what matters at the end of the day. If you think China's evil because they're communist, but I mean, what is the US doing? The US is trying to subvert China's sovereignty, its ability to decide its own internal political affairs. That is much worse. Imperialism is apex injustice. And if you're upset about injustice, you have to like do triage. What is the most pressing threat right now? It is imperialism. And then you work your way backwards. It doesn't mean like if you see something in front of you happening, it's within your power to stop it, you ignore it because you're like, I got to stop imperialism. But you know what I'm saying? If you're going to say, I don't like the way Chinese people, how their government is set up, that it's really not up to you. It's really irrelevant.
Yeah, it's
honest.
the same here. People will still say to me, well, yeah, okay, what the West did was bad, but Assad is a dictator, Syria is a police state, blah, 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 underpinning all the CIA talking points. But what they fail to do is to figure out this is a completely different society. Sorry, but your version of democracy is really not going to work here.
No,
because it's a patriarchal society. If you bring it down to the family in Syria, the father is the head of the family. And it doesn't matter how many times you fall out with that patriarch. It doesn't matter how pissed off you are with him. At the end of the day, you come to him to solve all your problems, right? And that's exactly how Syrian governance works. The presidency is the patriarchy. Then you have the government, and also what people don't understand is the government probably employs the largest number of civilians inside Syria itself. So, and it's not one institution, okay? Its fingers reach out into virtually all the institutions in Syria, including civil society, etc. And people, you're so right. People have this vision, whether it's the Middle East, whether it's China, Latin America, it doesn't matter. That they have a vision. Most people that come here on delegations go away shocked. Because why? Because they can go out in Damascus City and it's like being in Paris on Friday night.
Yes.
Yes. It's you'll have girls in hijab next to girls in miniskirts. And
yes,
they're astounded by it.
Well, I also want to point out that we were talking about how long the US has been trying to destroy Syria for decades and decades. So if you're a nation under siege, you cannot afford to have what the West would call an open and free society, which it isn't really open and free anyway. It's the illusion of being open and free. It's
Yeah.
the illusion of having some kind of choice. I mean, ask American voters, no matter who they vote into office, with the assumption that they're going to end the wars, there's always another war, all the wars,
Yeah.
and then another one. It's futile. That should tell you everything you need to know about whether it's genuine or just an illusion. But that aside, Syria has been a nation under siege, more or less at war this entire time,
Yeah.
targeted by the United States and its allies all of this time, and now literally at war. But even before 2011, it was not. It was that danger was always there. That part of their territory has been occupied for decades by
Yeah.
Israel. That is a nation at war. They have to be in that mentality in order to ensure self-preservation. And the same goes for China. China has a population over 1 billion people live in China. 1.4 or more billion people live in China. It is a huge country in terms of population, also geographically. And it is a nation that had been in the process of being colonized. Parts of its territory were taken from it. And the US, from the end of World War II until today, has been trying to stir up separatism, terrorism, violence, subverting political order and unity and harmony. And China as a country, in order to preserve itself, they need to work hard to preserve harmony and combat this invasive meddling that the US has been engaged in. It's more or less open now. I mean, they say that they have US troops in Taiwan while also recognizing the one China policy and recognizing that Taiwan is not an independent state. If it is not independent, then what is it? Then it is part of China, obviously. And they are putting troops on Taiwan. I mean, that China is a nation under threat by the US directly. It cannot afford to ignore these problems and indulge in the illusion of freedom and democracy but I would say, even that aside, if you go to China, you see the government dealing with the people's needs much more seriously than anywhere in the West. There might be a few exceptions in the West, but say the United States or the UK or Germany or France at this point, China is looking out for its people. Just go to China and see with your own eyes. Look at the infrastructure, look at the education system, look at the healthcare system, and then go back to the US for comparison. You won't be able to go back to the US. That was my problem. I joined the Marines and I picked to go to Japan. I always wanted to go overseas, and that was one of my options. So I picked to go to Japan. And the first day you're in Japan, you realize that, wow, people don't live like people in America do all around the world. It's totally different. And in a lot of ways, it's much, much better. And it's very hard to go back to that.
Yeah. Well, it's very much, I think, what people pick up on here and probably also in China is the sense of community, that's something that we've lost completely in the West. And that's how they're surviving the extreme pressure being put upon them by economic sanctions, the occupation of their resources, the burning of their crops, etc., etc., and the besieging of all their borders practically, apart from the border with Lebanon. But they've deliberately destroyed Lebanon to reduce down Syria's options for an exit route. And the reason that people are surviving, and people keep asking me this, is because of community. If one family is starving and another family has a little bit more than they need, then they'll give the little bit more that they need to that family. And we don't have that in the West. We've lost that.
Yes, significantly. And it's not something that is the result of American people. I'm familiar with America. It's not that American people are just inherently bad. It's the government, it's the media deliberately dividing people. If you go to China, everywhere you look, you see the government in a very conscious way trying to promote harmony and discourage division among people. And in the West, it is exactly the opposite. They look for any little thing that they can use to divide and distract people. Because if not, people are going to unify over the fact that the government is not looking out for their best interests. And they might do something about that. And so the way you prevent that from happening is dividing people over race, over gender, over politics, over the war, whichever war is going on at the time, and this has been a continuous process, and it has taken its toll on the American people. If that was rectified, then these people would end up getting back together, because that's human nature. This is a very conscious decision that these governments have made to do this to their own populations. It is an empire. Empire does that to its territories overseas. Usually at home, they would promote harmony, but in a lot of ways, these interests don't see themselves connected to the nations they live in. They don't see themselves as Americans. They see themselves above everyone.
Yeah.
And I don't know. It just seems like a very self-destructive mindset. It's a mindset and mentality that we've seen throughout history. During the decline of other empires in human history, and I think we're just watching it play out. It's hopeful, but it's also frightening, because a desperate empire is a dangerous empire, and I think we see that playing out in many places. Not just Ukraine currently, but if you're paying attention in Syria, here in Southeast Asia, regarding China and Taiwan, everywhere. It's lashing out. It's throwing a tantrum.
Yeah. Just one last question, Brian, if you've got time.
Sure.
If you're not too pushed. I just wanted to come back to Ukraine and ask you, I mean, we've had a lot of narrative management over the supply of long-range weapons, etc. And I know with your background in weaponry, you have very strong opinions on that. How far do you think Russia is down the road towards achieving what it wants to achieve in Ukraine? And to what extent do you think NATO member states are going to allow Russia to achieve what it wants to achieve?
Oh, that is a good question. I mean, Russia openly has said that its goal is to secure the Donbas region, and I think we see that. I think we see that happening right now before our eyes. The demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine is up to interpretation. They're obviously heavily demilitarizing Donbas. They're also denazifying it at the same time. It's kind of a 2-for-1 goal there. They did so in Mariupol and all of the other places that Russia has taken and is settling in. I mean, they're socioeconomically and politically integrating Kherson into what looks like the Russian Federation. So that is a process that's ongoing now. How far west are they going to go? I don't know. I don't know. I don't have access to that information, but what would the US and NATO, what would they try to do? I think it'll be very similar to what they've done in Syria. I think they'll try to create a buffer zone somewhere in the west. They'll try to avoid direct contact with Russian forces. I think they are seriously interested in grabbing Odessa before Russia does, because if not, what's going to be left of Ukraine? It's just going to be this landlocked, failed state full of Nazis who lost another war, and I wouldn't want to be the person responsible for taking care of that. And that's what the EU and the US, that's what they've bought here. And they're going to have some serious buyer's remorse when it's all said and done. How far west Russia goes, I don't know, because there's a lot of factors. It depends on what Russia's vision was at the very beginning. They didn't like really spell it out completely. But when the military of Ukraine collapses in the east, they're not going to have much left anywhere. I mean, they've been trying to launch these offensives around Kharkov and Kherson and utter failures. And it's because they have really nothing left. I mean, if they had forces in the west available to them and weapons in the West available to them, I think they would have sent a significant force to try to make these games. What they're trying to do with those offensives is get some sort of superficial victory on the board to distract away from the absolute strategic catastrophe unfolding in the Donbas region for them, and they're not even able to do that. So Russia knows best because they have the intelligence day to day. They see what's going on the ground. We're just kind of watching it and trying to make sense of it the best that we can. But I mean, obviously, right now, and as it has been, everything is in Russia's favor, and you can see that the West is really losing control over this conflict, if not having not been in control all along. And the idea of sending all these super weapons to Ukraine to turn the tide. It's funny because with these HIMARS, these rocket launchers, they're even like trying to preempt the huge disappointment people are going to have when they don't magically turn the tide by saying, well, don't expect too much. We're only sending 4. We don't really know how it's going to play out. And I mean, because that's after a whole string of these PR stunts with the Javelin, Stingers, and 777 howitzers. It's just one thing after the other. I think it's going the same way Syria is going. Only the one thing working in Ukraine's favor is that whatever territory Russia takes over is going to be directly connected to Russia and its economy. Syria is kind of isolated there. Russia has to do some logistics to get there. So I think that's the difference.
Yeah, and presumably whatever border is going to be drawn, there will need to be some kind of buffer zone. Otherwise, of course, you're just going to continue, aren't you, with the same kind of civil war that existed for the last 8 years with Donbass and Luhansk. So I'm guessing there would need to be some sort of buffer zone created with Russian patrols, as similar, of course, to what they've achieved in Idlib with Turkey, although Turkey's another matter altogether, maybe for another conversation. But very similar to what they achieved in Idlib in particular. So there's a safe zone that is patrolled. It would be difficult to find a neutral peacekeeper there, but for example, that was patrolled by Russian troops, etc., just to prevent the continuation of the aggression against Donbass and Luhansk.
Yes.
Brian, thank you so much for your time. I really loved talking to you. Just remind people where they can find you. And I would also mention your Telegram channels. We all forget to mention them, but actually Telegram is one of the few platforms where for the moment, we are not getting hamstrung and censored overnight.
Yes. Well, first, I just want to thank you again for having me on, and I will be happy to come back anytime. Just ask. You can find my work by just searching The New Atlas on YouTube, and then when you find my channel, just click on any video, look in the video description below, and I have listed Odyssey, Rumble. These are all YouTube alternatives. Also, my Telegram channel is in there. Also, the address to my blog, landdestroyer.blogspot.com. My New Atlas website is down. The reason why is because I hosted it in Russia because I didn't want it taken down by the US. And then because of the sanctions, I was not able to pay. So yeah, it is really affecting people. Like what the US is doing is affecting people. But as you can see, we're working around it.
Yeah, circumnavigating, which of course is what so many allied countries of Syria have done with some of the most unprecedented sanctions here in Syria.
Yes.
So it is possible, and people, it should give hope to people that to some extent independent media is becoming stronger, and it's certainly becoming more influential because they have to keep creating all of these media complex disinformation agents to try and take us down and discredit us. So
exactly.
we have to see that as a huge, or I always try to see that as a huge compliment to what we're doing.
Yes.
So keep doing it, Brian, because I definitely rely on the information that you put out, and I'm sure a lot more people do. So take care, and thank you so much for everything you do.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.